Willie, thank you so much for joining CNBC. I want to kick off by just getting a sense from you of where the airline industry is today.
Well, we're in a much better place today than we have been. The recovery is strong, and in fact, in many cases, stronger than we had expected. In July, we were at about 75% of where we were in 2019. And when you consider that we finished 2021 at around 42%, you can see the recovery during this year has been strong. And it continues to strengthen, despite some of the challenges we face. But it's much better today than it was.
Walk me through how oil prices are impacting the industry. They've come off a bit in recent weeks, but there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, oil is the most significant element of an airline's cost base. If I look at the 10 years between 2010 and 2019, which was the best 10 years in the industry's history, oil represented on average about 27% of the cost base. So it is very significant, and that was at Brent at an average of $80 a barrel. You know, we've seen Brent up to 130 and above. I think it's eased off a little in recent weeks, but it does represent a significant challenge for airlines. And what we've also seen is the the difference between Brent and jet has been stronger than I've ever seen it, to be honest. It typically represented about a spread of 18%. We've seen it as high as 60%. Last week, I think it closed at about 30%. So it's been quite volatile.
How tough is that for airlines to manage?
Very, very tough, because there's not a lot you can do. You know, if you fly, you use fuel. And given the financial state of many airlines, it's difficult for the airlines to absorb that additional price. So ultimately, it will find its way to consumers in the form of higher ticket prices. Yeah. Some airlines have hedging in place, but that hedging will start unwinding as we go into 2023. So our hope is that the price eases a little bit, but more importantly, that the crack spread between Brent and jet, that narrows back to where it would
traditionally be. And speaking of that cost, I've got to ask you about the holiday travel days. Are we anticipating that consumers are going to have to pay more for their tickets?
Yeah, and in fact, I think some consumers are seeing that already. It's not something that airlines would like to see, because it's not that airlines are making money, it's that airlines are just passing on a cost that they can't absorb themselves and that they can't avoid. So, we have seen ticket prices higher this year than we would have expected, and indeed in some cases higher than they were in 2019. But I think the good news is that oil prices do seem to be coming down a little bit, but then who knows what the price will be next year.
Absolutely, and of course energy is something we cover a great deal on CNBC. When you think about this from the investment perspective, whether I'm talking to oil and gas CEOs or energy ministers right here in the region, they're telling me over and over again that the problem is a lack of investment in spare capacity. How concerned are you?
Yeah, that is very concerning, and we'd seen that with the price of jet, because clearly a lot of refining capacity disappeared during 2020 and 2021 when the demand was quite low. Bringing that capacity back on as the airline industry recovered and demand for jet fuel increased has been much slower than we had expected, and I think it also does signify a lack of investment in refining in recent years. So it is of concern to the industry. I think the positive is that more and more we're turning our attention to sustainable aviation fuels. And what we want to see is, rather than investment in traditional refinery, we'd like to see investment in the production of sustainable aviation fuel, because the environmental challenge we face is very significant. Yeah. And sustainable aviation fuels do represent the best option that the industry has to achieve our target of net zero in 2050.
Do you think that goal is still realistic given where we are today? Because when we talk about that renewable investment, if you're sitting out here in countries that have been making windfall profits as a result of the oil and gas dynamic, that's an easy play for them to put a lot of that money into renewables. But back in the rest of the world, we're having significant issues in terms of the P&L.
I think you're absolutely right. However, I don't think there's going to be a choice. The world needs to recognize the urgency associated with dealing with environmental issues. The airline industry is committed to achieving net zero in 2050. The alternatives available to us are limited. Technology will make a difference, but probably not in the time frame that we're talking about out to 2050. We'll certainly see some impact, but sustainable aviation fuel will be very important. And the industry wants to purchase it, even at the elevated prices we're seeing. The premium for sustainable aviation fuel today is about 2 to 3 times the price of jet kerosene. And the industry used every single drop of sustainable aviation fuel that was available in 2021, and will do the same in 2022. So the demand for this product exists.
Right.
So I think if you're looking long term and you want to make investment, the area to focus your investment in will be in sustainable fuels rather than into traditional jet kerosene.
What is the message to policymakers here? Because you have a wide variety of responses to the energy crisis that we find ourselves in today. And when I speak to energy ministers, at least in this part of the world, they tell me that this is a crisis that they keep continuing for quite a while.
Yeah, I think we need to get the policy framework right. The concern that the airline industry has is that politicians will turn to taxation to address an environmental challenge, and we know that taxation does nothing.
They're already doing it.
In some cases they have already, and there's plenty of evidence where we can show that imposing taxes won't actually improve the environmental performance. And what it does is it will take our money out of the industry that can be used for in-sector changes to reduce our environmental footprint. So I think the policy framework is absolutely critical, and especially now. If we're looking to the future in 2050 and that net zero target, which most governments are committed to, we need to make sure we have the right policies in place, the right frameworks in place to assist everybody, not just the airline industry, but to assist everybody in that transition, so as to ensure that we have an economy when we get to 2050.
Speaking of those policies, when you look at the global response to COVID and the pandemic, U.S. President Joe Biden says the pandemic is over, and yet you have countries in Asia specifically with still some pretty rigid COVID restrictions, and it's impacting your industry.
Yeah, very much so. And in fact, if I look at that recovery in the industry, what we see is a big variation. So within Asia, for example, international travel within Asia in July was still only 25% of where it was in 2019. Whereas the Middle East to North America, for example, is now 10% ahead of where we were in 2019. So you can see parts of the world, particularly in Asia, lagging significantly behind. And it's principally because of border closures. It's not a fear of flying, because we can see that once restrictions are removed, people will immediately want to get back to where they were and get back moving again. So we were disappointed with the response from governments. We had a single pandemic. It was the same virus everywhere, and yet we saw governments responding in so many different ways. You would have expected to see greater coordination. Even within the EU, we saw different countries within the EU adopt different policies. So I'd like to think that we'll see a more coordinated, better planned approach to the next pandemic, and no doubt there will be one. But we have reiterated our view that the WHO guidance, which was don't close your borders, was the right guidance, and we would hope that governments will have learned and will have sort of looked more closely at the economic harm that was created by these border closures.
Because COVID's not traveling with cargo.
No, and that was the issue. All of the evidence shows that closing your borders did nothing to stop the virus spreading. It continued to spread. And in fact, the research that we've done suggests that at best it may have slowed down the peak by days. Not even by weeks, by days. So while I can understand the need for governments to take action early on, I think it's disappointing that as data became available, governments didn't address their response based on the data. And actually what we saw was more political science influence.
Is this an industry, in your view, that's ever going to be pandemic proof?
Well, it's an industry that can withstand significant shocks and challenges. Like, I have to be honest, I am surprised at how robust the industry is, having come through the deepest crisis we've ever seen. I expected more airlines to fail. I think it's great credit to airline management teams right across the world and everybody working in the airline industry that we still have an industry, given that we were effectively shut down for 2 years. To be able to survive that has been a fantastic achievement. I'd like to think we won't face a challenge on this scale again. The challenges we faced in the past have tended to be deep but short. This was deep and deeper than anything we had seen, and much longer than anything we had seen before. So the industry learns. We will adapt. I think part of the reason we are still in business today is we've learned lessons from previous crises. But let's hope we don't see another one like this.
When you think about what happens next with regards to inflation, the dollar, what's your greatest concern there? Because as we were saying a little bit earlier, there are there is a school of thought that they should have acted more quickly, central banks.
Yeah, I think inflation clearly is a concern to everybody. And we've seen high inflation before. I've been in the industry for over 40 years. I can remember times when inflation was even higher than we're seeing today. I suppose the positive is, we're seeing a lot more employment today. In previous periods of high inflation, often it was associated with low employment or high unemployment. We're not seeing that. So the dynamic is slightly different. But I think we do need to address this inflation surge that we are seeing.
Yeah.
And certainly, my opinion, and I'm not an economist, is that I think governments could have responded earlier by increasing interest rates sooner than they did. Because, this, if you like, tsunami that's coming at consumers with high energy prices, high inflation, and now higher interest rates, having come through a period where they've become accustomed to very low interest. But, as I said, we've seen some of these issues before. The positive that I take is at least we're in a period of high employment.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine at this point, the impact on the industry specifically. And when you think about it, what is the long-term impact? Because we talked about closing borders and the fact that Russia is looking to other suppliers than the West, as they have done in the past.
Yeah, in terms of the impact on the industry directly, it's not significant, in terms of the traffic flows. Russia, big domestic market, not as significant international market, the same for Ukraine. Clearly, we've got to condemn what's happening. It's terrible to see the war in Ukraine, the lives that are being lost. What it has done is it's impacted on oil prices, clearly, which, as we talked about earlier, is a big issue for the airline industry. And going forward with the closure of Russian airspace, it will have a big impact on traffic flows between Asia and Europe, because most of those flights traditionally go through Russia. Now, today, we're still only at about 40% of where we were in 2019. So it's not having a significant impact for the industry. For some airlines, like you look at Finnair in Finland, they've had to completely change their network because, it's impossible for them really to serve Asia from Finland, given that they now have to bypass Russian and Ukrainian airspace. So it does represent a challenge.
Yeah.
I think we would all hope that this war will come to an end, very, very quickly, and we can get back to a more normal existence.
And who do you see as getting the windfall from that? Is it the regional carriers here in the Middle East? Is it elsewhere? Because you have, as you say, those issues in Asia. Now we have those issues between Russia and Ukraine impacting flyover areas. What does it look like to you?
Yeah, I think carriers in the Middle East do have an opportunity as traffic flows change to avoid Russian airspace. We've not seen it to the degree that we had expected. We are seeing the traffic flows through the Middle East increasing or improving at a faster rate than most other areas, which reflects the value of the hubs here in the region, which, you've got Dubai and Doha in particular, two significant global hubs, and they do stand to benefit as we go forward.
And just finally, give me a sense of where you see the industry in terms of growth.
Well, we're still in a recovery period. There's still quite a bit to go before we can recover to where we are in 2019. We still believe growth for the industry will average at around 3 to 3.5% per annum going forward over the next 10, 15 years, which is, significant in traditional terms. Maybe lower than it would have been had we not seen this crisis. But our outlook is still quite positive. Now, there are challenges, but I think the general outlook remains positive for the industry.
Great to have you on the program. Thanks so much for joining CNBC.
Thank you very much.